Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Daryl Gay. I'm a partner at Aaron Fox, and I'm co-host of this program with my good buddy Jay Jamrock from I4CP. It's our pleasure to bring you another segment of Practical Talk. We have a very interesting conversation today with two great speakers. They're going to enlighten us about some approaches to handling issues of employment and talent. I'm going to let Jay introduce John, and I'll introduce Dion.
Good. Thank you, Daryl. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I have the honor of introducing somebody I consider a friend and somebody who's influenced my career as I've gone along the last 40 years. I think John and I go back about 30 years. And his work and his thinking have always not just stimulated me, but given me a headache at times. John is recognized worldwide as a leading evidence-based visionary on the future of work and organization. John is well known for his breakthrough research on bridge between work, superior human capital, leadership, and sustainable competitive advantage. He's a much sought after by organizations, business, and academics for his insight and innovation in fields of the future of work and organizations. John is currently Professor Emeritus. Have you gotten used to that yet, John? From Emeritus of Management and Organizations, and a senior research scientist at the Center of Effective Organizations and Marshall School of Business, University of Southern California. Where I first met John was before he went to USC, he was at Cornell for 20 years, where he founded and ran an organization called CARS, which is Advanced Human Resource Studies and Research. He's authored more than 200 publications, including more than 10 books. Beyond HR, I got to admit, was one of your best, John. I mean, I love the future of work, but Beyond HR, I really like. And his speeches work has appeared in Harvard Business Review, Wall Street Journal, Fortune, Fast Company, Business Week, and the list goes on and on and on, especially when you go global in global magazines and articles. So very pleased that John could take the time out of his business schedule and talk about his latest best-selling book, Work Without Jobs. And we're going to have an interesting conversation as we have litigators who are going to be asking John very, very serious questions about this whole concept of work without jobs. By the way, John and I talk at least once a week, so it's he gives me a headache at least once a week.
So I don't know if we're going to be litigators, John, but I think we're definitely going to challenge some of your thoughts and theories because we've got people that ask the same questions. But it's my pleasure to introduce our co-speaker, which is Dion Blake. I've just gotten to know Dion, but I really, really like working with her so far and hope to get working with her more often. Dion serves as the vice president in law at Target Corporation. She oversees 100 legal professionals at Target, ensuring and overseeing Target's employment law, labor, and investigative functions. She's been there several years and has had a total over 15 years of experience in the retail industry. And she's going to bring a great perspective as in-house on some of the issues. I'm the outside counsel who has to come into. So, you know, you're getting double shot here, John, but don't worry about it. I know you can handle it. I read your book.
I got your back. I got your back. I got your back, John. But what we would like to start out with, since a lot of people maybe are not familiar with the book, Work Without Jobs, which is a phenomenal book. Why don't you give us about 5 or 10 minutes of Management 101, of concepts of the book, what you're trying to get across, and where you think the future of work is going, especially, you know, around the concepts with your book.
Well, thank you, Jay. Let me begin, of course, by thanking Aaron Fox Schiff and Daryl. Thank you very much, you and Jay both, for agreeing to give me the privilege of joining this group. Dion, just as Daryl said, we hadn't really had much contact before. The more I've gotten to know you and preparing for this, the more admiration I have for the terrific work that you're doing as well. And Daryl, you're right. I was telling the story. It's been a while since I was addressing a group of legal professionals, and I can't wait to hear their perspective, likely different from the CHROs and HR leadership teams and leadership teams that I often work with on this. So again, I'm looking forward to that. I told the story. At Cornell, the Industrial and Labor Relations School is also kind of a pre-law program because it's a state school with state tuition inside a private university with a terrific law school. And of course, labor and industrial relations are also very legally based. And my first class in 1981, in September, I stepped in front of my first class at Cornell. I wrote my name on the board and immediately was entered into a litigation-like debate about what the students should call me for 10 minutes. That's when I realized I was in a pre-law school at the undergraduate level. Kindness, Daryl and Jay, I appreciate you having my back, but I'm also really interested in the perspective of this group. So with that, let me give you a quick 5 to 10 minute summary of some of the ideas in Work Without Jobs. Let me first offer due and important credit to my co-author, first author on the book, Ravin J. Suthasan. Ravin is a principal at Mercer. I really encourage you to look him up. He's a global thought leader in his own right, and has been largely responsible for a lot of the popularity of these ideas. He and Mercer promoting and working on them. So please do look up my co-author, Ravin J. Suthasan, as well as perhaps connect with me. So again, thanks. So here's the book. The book is called Work Without Jobs. Now, that doesn't really mean that we are projecting a world in which there will be no jobs. What we're getting at is that we see increasing situations where using the job as the metaphor or even the representation of work, the only way we can think of work, is pretty typical in a lot of organizations. I think virtually every HR system is still based on a work unit called a job, sometimes translated into full-time equivalents or something like that. But for the most part, when people talk about work, it's not difficult for them to fall into what I would call the trap of equating work with jobs. Our policymakers do that all the time. I can't tell you how much I wince when I hear very smart, well-meaning policymakers saying we've got to create more good jobs. I think that immediately limits the alternatives, and I would prefer to use the phrase creating something like good work, and that would allow for work to exist outside of jobs. Now, we're not projecting a world without jobs in the future. What we are projecting is that there are certain situations now that show us that equating work with a job, confining work to a job, I'm using this square to show confined, is actually creating a great deal of difficulty. It happens in areas like this. These are the signals that we see and talk about in the book. One would be significant labor or talent resource constraints. We can't fill these jobs. We can't upskill people fast enough. Our job openings are open for months, et cetera. Those are often situations in which the problem is we're trying to find people who are fully qualified for a job, or to write a job description as we're trying to change, as we're trying to be agile. And that creates these, or expecting that everyone be fully qualified for this job. And a solution there is to be able to say, let's take the job apart. Let's let it melt into its tasks, into its projects. And let's look at all of those things independent of whether or not they reconfigure into a job. Think about melting an ice cube, huh? Now that liquid could be reconfigured in lots of different ways that might not be the ice cube it started with. When we allow that to happen, we can, for example, think of a labor shortage somewhat in terms of our demand side rather than just the supply side. Rather than why don't we find more people who are fully qualified for this job, we can ask ourselves, what if the work was changed so that it matched better the people who are 80% qualified? And then what would we do with the other 20%? Okay, so similar thing, melting the job into its tasks, its projects, et cetera. Melt the individual worker into their capabilities. I'm going to call that. What can they do? Some of you may be very familiar with skills-based work in organizations, where organizations are trying to look at the work and the skills that it needs and look at the worker in terms of the skills that they have. That allows one to think pretty fluidly about how the person might be upskilled. That's the most popular look at that. And then it also might allow us to think about, I would say, the work as fluid as well. Now, I'm delighted at the skills initiatives because they have caused leaders everywhere to realize that you can think about work and workers in this melted, deconstructed way. I am a little less in agreement that skills are going to be the basis, the currency. I think instead it's going to be capabilities. The difference is a skill might be knowing the Spanish language. A capability might be the ability to simultaneously translate speech versus another capability with that skill might be translating manuscripts, et cetera. Okay, so think capabilities when we think about workers, not job holders as much as a set of capabilities. When we think about the capabilities and the parts of the job sort of running together as fluid, we can think about matching that might not occur to us if we were in a way trapped in thinking about the work must fit into this job, and I must look for someone who's fully qualified for that job. So that's the idea. One of them is labor shortages. Another one is agility. When things are changing quickly, when work is being designed in an agile way, or when we're trying to respond to agile customer changes and demands and update our products, that often reflects into the work, where people find that the job they're doing is not necessarily always matching up to the work that needs to be done. And so that's another example, another symptom where we think you can say, oh, I see, we're trying to do agile. For some reason, we can't seem to keep up with our work systems. Might that be a place where you would introduce this idea of work without jobs? What if we let the work melt? What if we let the workers melt? Again, it may reconfigure into jobs, so let's all stay calm here. But let's at least let it melt first and then ask ourselves, how might we approach agile with this melted concept of work? And it might end up being that we put work into a pool and then have teams of workers that do it. So then a third one is automation. We'll probably talk a lot about that today. Automation virtually never neatly replaces a person in a job. Virtually never. It is, so therefore, it is the completely wrong question to ask, will automation take my job? It is a completely wrong question to examine economically, how many jobs will automation take away? Every study that's ever been done had to first break the job into its component parts. That's the only place you can see the true effect of work automation. Leaders, workers, etc., often are very confused because automation is sold as a way to redeploy or reduce the use of people in jobs. Managers are often tasked with implementing automation with a payoff that it will free up a certain number of people in jobs. That's very confusing when they try to do it. And that was the topic of one book before with Robin, Reinventing Jobs. Why? Because automation does not lift and shift a job neatly. What it does is it affects the tasks within the job. Some of them are replaced. Some of them are augmented. People are going to do the same thing, but they're going to be more accurate, they're going to be faster, etc. Some of them are transformed to create a worker who's even better. So things like that are where we think things like agile, things like shortages, things like automation are places where Robin and I believe that allowing leaders to think outside the job, to think outside the job holder, to allow these things to melt, is a way to allow them to get beyond these dilemmas, to address these dilemmas with a much more flexible, fluid approach to the work that enhances the flexibility of workers, the security of workers, often inclusion. Now, I don't want to just paint the positive picture, but there are some real interesting potential advantages to allowing organizations to think about work outside of jobs and job holders in the places where it makes the most difference.
Well, that scratches my question on AI, John. So we've had this conversation before.
There's a lot to unpack there, Jay, and you're a real expert in it. So,
So John, let's start out probably the 800-pound gorilla in the room. A lot of this sounds great for the companies, but obviously employees are going to say, this is a slick way of replacing me or are manipulating me or are taking advantage of me. You know, there's a lot of pushback across the country against gig work, use of freelancers across the world. And, you know, immediately the third parties I think we need to deal with, does this really benefit only the company or does it benefit the employee too? And so how?
That's a really good point. And I guess I should mention that one of the situations, sorry, Daryl, did I interrupt you?
No, I was coughing. Sorry.
Okay, bless you. So, Daryl, one of the things that I mentioned that I didn't mention, one of the indicators that you might need to free up your thinking is when there are very highly qualified workers that exist in a way that would not want to be employees of your organization or can be engaged in ways that aren't employment. So that's another one. There is and Jay, you and I have worked on this. I4CP has written about this. Robin and I wrote 2 books ago, a book called Lead the Work with David Creelman, another person you should follow. So Daryl, you're right. One of the reasons for this book was that there is this emerging ecosystem of workers that can be engaged outside the employment relationship or in ways that are different from the employment relationship. It is a growing group. It grew a lot during COVID. It often the best qualified worker you can find works on a platform. A lot of the best attorneys in the world work in a platform base, sort of loosely connected, but they move from project to project, which keeps them sharp. They're only working on the thing that they need to be an expert on. If they were in an organization, a company, they'd have to work on lots of other stuff. So it isn't always that kind of work is exploitive or that it's only available for low level, least qualified kinds of work. If you look at the platforms and what's out there, as it's really a very fertile ground for flexibility in the way that you, an organization, engage with workers and the way they engage with you. Now, Daryl, can that be, and it's easier to think about that if you allow yourself to think about parts of a job rather than a whole job. It is sometimes the case, but again, very often not the case, that one of those workers engaged in a non-employment way often don't do the whole job. They're best suited to do part of a job. And so again, the deconstruction of the job helps you see in a granular way where these kinds of workers might best be deployed. And that will often mean that they're doing something that a person with a job used to do. So again, that construction is what happens. Now to your question. Thanks for letting me give a little background. It is absolutely true that there is a significant danger and possibility of exploitation in a world where workers are engaged outside of an employment contract. It is absolutely the case, Daryl, that a system like that can devolve to what I would call kind of the lowest common denominator. Very transactional, very very much trying to extract the maximum for every dollar, kind of a, I don't want to say, I don't want to be derisive about procurement, but that kind of word of we want to get the best thing we can get for the least possible cost. And it's in procurement that these relationships are often formed rather than over in the human resources world, which often deals with people in jobs. Can be exploitive, absolutely can. On the other hand, done properly with appropriate values, there are plenty of examples of not only non-exploitive relationships, Daryl, but relationships where the worker is actually more engaged and more satisfied with the work that they do because they have greater agency, because they can focus on the thing that they want to do well, because they do have the freedom to morph into something else. And that often is not the case in a world in which they're in a job. We need better safety nets. Absolutely. We need those workers that don't have a job to have access to health insurance, to have access to pensions, retirement, et cetera. We need a world in Europe, some countries are much better at this, a world in which there is that kind of portability so that workers are not bound to an organization in a job to keep those kinds of safety net elements. And that's often part of the reason people are worried about exploitation is companies are trying to get work done without providing that sort of benefit, et cetera. Does it happen? Is it possible? Absolutely. However, Daryl, I think it's more a matter of the values of the organization than it is about the particular work arrangement.
So one of the questions put to us was right on touching one of your things, you said benefits. People want to do gig work, but they're worried about losing their benefits, which you've raised right now. But it sounds like what you said, that's going to be something that we're going to have to talk to our policymakers and politicians about for changing some rules. Am I correct about that?
Yes, I would like to see, I would really love, and I'm not doing very much right now with it, Daryl. I think some of the folks on this call might be in great positions to do it. I agree, there needs to be an opening up of that discussion at the policy level. And again, for me, the simple catchphrase would be every time a policymaker uses the word job, I'd like to substitute the word work and see if that doesn't bring us to some different conclusions about what we mean by a country that supports good work. One of the implications I think is going to be if I don't let you use job as the metaphor for work, you can't escape by saying, oh, companies provide all that stuff. I don't need to worry about that as a policymaker. Companies do health insurance, they do pensions. So if I can just get people into jobs, then I solve that. Well, I would respectfully disagree.
Yeah,
I
the
say,
biggest-
let's think about good work. Then you've got to include people who work, but may not have a formal job. And what do we do about them? How do we empower them? And how do we make sure that their work environment is equally as what shall I say, as mutual, as protected, and they have the power they should have in a relationship, even if it's not a job.
I think, John, as I'm listening to this, and I certainly can think about some of the benefits as you think about, for example, engagement and growth and being agile. But one of the things that, first comes to mind for me is, one, I have a lot of questions, so I'll start with this one. How do you make the distinction, particularly in an organization where there are jobs that you may want to deconstruct and think about the work, and then there are others that you decide not to, or you are unable to do that? And then how do you bridge the communication with your employees as to who ends up with those jobs that have, from my perspective, the benefit of work deconstructed versus those that don't? And how do you even navigate that in the workplace?
Yeah, I thank you, Dion. That's a terrific question. I don't know, and I will say, as a sort of scholar and researcher, as my basic career path, I always try to be careful to say when I'm not expert on something, and that's an awful lot of what we're talking about. So I will say, I don't know that there's a good deal of research on that yet, and I don't have a great deal of practical experience with it. I think that what we see in examples in organizations now, let's see, and I'll give a few things. So we see this kind of approach to work happening a lot in the world of automation, a lot. And increasingly, I think, in the world of work automation, it's being recognized, at least viscerally, if not explicitly, that this deconstruction has got to happen. And that's where the level of discussion has to happen. We see it also, and some of you may be involved in organizations that have something that might be called an internal talent marketplace. That's a platform inside your organization where your leaders can deconstruct jobs they might post, make them into projects, put them on a platform, and your workers can see those projects and take them on. Those are also often done with a targeted group, with a certain kind of work to begin with. It may be work that is pretty easily projectized, something like cloud development, something like that would be a typical example, but they use them for product design, et cetera, in many organizations, something like that. What we see, I think, right now, Dion, is that organizations do implement these in some areas and not others. I think the general explanation is something around something I support very much, and I'd like to see more of, an approach to work that is more of a design experiment approach. So pretty transparent about, we're going to be doing this kind of deconstruction over here. That's because these people are trying to work in a world where automation is changing their work quickly. And it's going to make a lot of sense to them that we use a kind of deconstructed approach. I think or we're going to open up this internal talent marketplace initially to this kind of work, because that's the kind of work we think is the best experiment, or where we'll learn the most. So I think that right now, Dion, my thinking is that what organizations are doing is they're being pretty transparent about it being in a limited area. They often don't even call it work deconstruction. It's just happening because that's where automation demands it. That's where fluidity demands it, agile demands it, et cetera. So I don't know yet that we have the have and have not question. We do see it emerging, and Jay and I have talked about this a lot, in the world of flexibility, particularly in the world of flexibility with regard to hybrid and remote. And we do see it emerging in jobs that have been, I think, understandably, but naively classified as not being eligible for flexibility. Frontline jobs, jobs that require you to be at locations, jobs that require you to be in a technology like a truck or something like that. It turns out that there is a good deal of flexibility that can be offered even in those jobs, particularly around scheduling and that kind of thing. So yes, there's a have and have not issue about work. We see it already in the world of work flexibility and hybrid. We may see it in terms of deconstruction, but for the moment, Dion, I think this is so new and often applied in a place that is so desperate for it, like automation or agile, that everybody can kind of look at that and say, yeah, that makes sense over there.
John, let me take it, for some of the people in the audience might not understand exactly what you mean by deconstruction. So let me take it this way. I live in a world of traditional labor law. We have unions and defined jobs and their job descriptions. So I'm going to take two particular titles, a receptionist and a nurse. Can you kind of walk through us what you mean by deconstruction, how that could work for either one of those capacities, and how you could tie AI into part of the deconstruction part? Example, for example, with the RN or something like that.
Thank you, Daryl. And this is a book that we use as a final case study in the book, a case rather. Again, let me give credit, as I try to do, to the brilliant people that I get to work with. And that includes a team of HR leaders and leaders generally at a place called Providence Health. And Greg Till, whom I met through an I4CP event, is the CHRO there. And again, I would look Greg up and follow him. He's a very good source of this. So what happened at Providence? Providence Health runs hospitals in the Northwest United States and a few other places. Some of you that work with healthcare organizations may know them. And like a lot of healthcare organizations, when COVID hit, the nursing shortage, which existed anyway, became life or death if it wasn't before. And of course, if you calculate the nursing shortage by saying, well, we have a nurse job, and that's an ice cube, and it looks like this. And we have a qualified nurse, and that's an ice cube that looks like someone who's completed this particular 4-year or other degree program. And we know when someone is qualified to be a nurse by when they fit the ice cube that says they're a qualified candidate, and we can fit them into the ice cube called a job that's called a nurse, and they do everything that's in that job. And if we calculate the gap between those who are the ice cubes that will need a worker called a nurse and the ice cubes that are fully qualified nurses, you get millions in shortages. That, of course, was life and death for Providence. So basically fueled by the blowtorch that is COVID, like so many workforce changes, they melted the ice cube of the nurse. And that ice cube contained a lot of things that nurses call top of license: intubating patients, delivering medication, responding to emergencies, that kind of thing. Nurses do that. It's purposeful for them. It's why they got into the profession for the most part. But there's also things in that nurse job like checking in on well patients, looking in the room. How are you doing? Patient responds. You check off that they're responsive. That takes the time of nurses. Well, what Providence realized, there was this job, to Daryl's point, this job called a receptionist, let's call it. And of course, we didn't have that many people coming into the hospital who weren't patients during COVID. And receptionists are qualified to look in on patients and make a check mark on a chart that says, I looked in, they responded, etc. If receptionists could do some of that, that would allow us to increase the ice cube called a nurse job doing top of line work. There was stuff called scheduling. It took hours for nurses, it turns out. Well, as many of you know and would guess, there's scheduling software that can do in minutes what it might take a nurse a day to do. And in addition, that software can provide some of the flexibility that Jay and I have been talking about a lot in terms of scheduling. So nurses can choose their schedules and they can say, I can only work this time. And the scheduling software, unlike a human, can see all the permutations and can often find solutions to scheduling dilemmas. So let's get scheduling off of them. And that gives us back a day a week of nurses. And we gave that task to automation. So now checking in on well patients, scheduling has melted and moved and been frozen into another place in the organization. And then finally, even with all of that, they had a shortage of capacity to do top-line nursing tasks. So they asked, where in our organization do we have individuals with the capability to do nursing tasks that are not doing them because their job title doesn't include it? Well, they immediately thought of administrators, many of whom are former physicians, and if relicensed, would be eligible and qualified to be on the floor, let's say a day a week, to do top of line nursing work. So now we've taken something that was embedded in the nursing ice cube and needs top of line qualifications, and we've melted it and moved it to someone else who has that capability, but it wasn't part of their job title. So administrators still have an administrator job, and now they float to the floor 1 day a week. Daryl, I hope that gets the example you were looking for.
You combined all, including the technology was important. I think
Hey, John.
how would people not see, I'm sorry, go ahead, Jay, my apologies.
Okay, John, we've talked a lot about the internal and external gig market, and a lot around the internal gig market. A couple things. One, the external gig market seems to be exploding into almost crowdsourcing in some cases like NASA, et cetera. The internal gig market, companies are using a little bit of AI with their capability skill database, and then having an internal talent marketplace, an internal gig market, if you will, internally. The one, and it's used very well, Daryl, if you're looking for the benefit of an employee as a development tool, as a way to get them more experience, more knowledge, more development as they go along to increase their own career paths. The problem that some have pointed out to me has been, it's almost like ghost hiring for the internal gig market. So many companies have had goals since 2020 around DE&I, diversity inclusion goals that would, make the workplace a more inclusive environment for everybody. If we're not hiring that much externally anymore, and we're moving around more internal people to work on projects, et cetera, and using the external gig market, does that hurt a company's ability to reach their DE&I goals or their ESG goals? And how do they overcome that if they want to?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, Jay. I think if I can sort of just feed it back to you.
Yep.
It is absolutely the case, and I think again, it's interesting to frame it. I think people would say one of the advantages, and I'm not arguing with you, at least not yet, Jay, but I think people say one of the advantages of letting work become more fluid, let's say, or deconstructed, allowing some of the work to be seen as work without jobs, is that you then can open up something like an internal talent market based on projects and capabilities where people can voluntarily take on projects. And that's how most of them work. Even though they're your employees, they're voluntarily taking something on without getting paid for it because they have a passion for it, or because it builds a skill, or it makes them visible to a group they want to work with, something like that. It turns out that voluntarism, that willingness to do that, is much higher than I thought. Now, you're right, Jay. What that does is it offers a really interesting alternative way to engage people, your employees, internally, to allow your employees to pursue things that their job might not necessarily let them pursue. And it is going to retain them, and it is going to take the pressure off needing to hire someone from the outside. Absolutely all true. You raise an interesting point. If hiring from the outside was the way we were accomplishing diversity, because we just don't have enough of people of color, or whatever is your diversity, criterion you're working on, you're right that it could reduce the number of external folks we need to hire, and thereby maybe reduce one of the mechanisms that someone might be using for inclusion. Now, I would say, in another, contrary to that thinking, you might also discover that you're retaining more of a diverse population, again, using whatever, whether it's neurodiversity or gender diversity or racial diversity, whatever is your measure. You may find that you retain folks that are different with systems that are more fluid, because they have more freedom to find their place in the organization. They don't have to wait for the next job to open up. They don't have to wait for their boss in that job to allow them to do something. In addition, Jay, these internal talent markets are kind of a click away from both, and from combining with an external talent market, like a freelance platform. And when you open up that external platform, crowdsourcing, freelancers, borrowing employees from other employers that have the expertise you need, contractors, a lot of things we talked about in the book, Lead the Work, You could make the argument, Jay, that that is going to increase your diversity and inclusion, because you'll now be able to tap into diverse populations without the restriction that the only way you can engage them is with a job.
Yeah, it opens up that talent ecosystem much wider and opens up your lens so you can think of not a scarcity of talent, but a scarcity of skills, and really look deeply into how you're doing. And the retention issue is huge with the DE&I goals. So,
Well,
and-
yeah, and I want to put a check on the concept of, at least particularly internal to an organization, DE&I not just being the hiring component, but the retention, the engagement, and the development component. Right. I
Correct.
think that's really important, because as you think about what I believe we are all hearing is experiences are very important, right? And that sense of belonging and that sense of inclusion, which is why it's DE and the I, right? And that sense of what brings me fulfillment. As I'm listening to this conversation, I am thinking about, and anyone on the panel, and John challenged me, are we also talking or thinking of the ability to flex in and out of spaces, work, and experiences as sort of a alternative or in conjunction with what used to be an external educational component? And what I mean by that is I work at my job and I have an educational benefit. And so, I take classes, I get a certification, I may get another degree, et cetera. Is this a way to think about that, building those skills and capabilities through the work itself versus through formal education, and the workplace being the place to do so?
we know that there's this old saying of 70-20-10 as far as learning goes, and 10% is only you from the classroom, 20% comes from your boss or your mentor. The 70% comes from getting experiences of doing the actual work.
Mhm.
And you're absolutely right. This retention and development tool that it allows you to leverage in an internal marketplace, internal talent marketplace, can be a powerful weapon for developing talent.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree, Dion. I think let's make the, I think, Jay, you're right. Let's make the positive case. I think if you allow the work to melt into tasks, projects, et cetera, if you allow yourself to see workers, both within and outside your organization, more as a complete array of capabilities, both ones that exist and ones that could be developed. I think when you look at work and workers that way, it changes, I think, the frame to start asking, well, what are the capabilities in a worker that we're not capturing? Look at all these capabilities our workers have.
And adjacent capabilities also.
And exactly. So you think about ERGs, for example. I think those are an excellent vehicle toward all sorts of awareness and action around diversity, inclusion, et cetera. Those ERGs are often voluntary, and they often tap into the capabilities of workers in ways that their job didn't. That's not to say the job is bad, but it's to say that if you think about a worker as having an array of capabilities, which the job overlaps about this much, I think it opens up just what you said, that idea that, number one, they have capabilities we might not be using. And then number two, as you think about the work evolving, rather than thinking about what jobs will people hold in the future, I think that allows you to think in terms of what would it take to get our workers, optimally more qualified for the work that we see coming. So they may not yet be ready for the full job description that we expect in the future, but they could be 80% ready if we gave them this 20% more skills. Those internal talent markets, Dion, often make this very transparent. It's very clear what projects are being posted, what capabilities are being demanded. It's very clear to someone where if they just had capability X, they would be more qualified to move into that thing that interests them, or maybe even into a new job. So I think it opens up that idea of workers really now being able to ask, based on transparent data, how could I get that qualification that would get me 20% more qualified for something that I want to do? And the options then may be, as you said, well, we have this thing you can do internally. Obviously, there would be traditional education. That means education needs to melt. Universities need to think not just in terms of an ice cube called a degree, but the parts of the degree. And could we deliver those parts? In many universities, we talk about this in the book, they call it stackable credentials, meaning you get one, you go work, you come back and stack on another, you go work, you stack on another. And at the end of the day, you do get a degree, but we're thinking more in terms of this melted way of doing it.
You
So,
know,
John-
you talk about the developments of 1 second, Daryl, the example that John gave of the RN and the receptionist. He used a lot of words to talk about how they deconstructed the RN's work and gave it to the receptionist, but we didn't think about the receptionist, who's now developing new skills, new
Exactly.
capabilities,
Right.
and can actually start doing more value add work for the organization than just punching people in the way that they used to. It's just, it's a win-win if you think about it from the employee's perspective, not just from the organization's perspective. Daryl, I interrupted you.
No problem, because that's a good point, Jay. I like that. That's why I brought the reception up versus the, because it is the growth concept. It allows the employee to grow, and it opens opportunities when you think this way. It makes employees incentivized to stay at the company, because now I'm not just doing X, I can do X, Y, and Z. And I think this is something we had talked to unions about negotiating this. This is the way to present to unions as a concept. This helps the employees grow as well. So,
Right.
John, all of this is going to change. We're talking about changing how the employees are hired, how the employees are used, but this is also going to require a change in mindset of leadership. So could you spend a second talking about the mindset issues regarding from C-suite to mid-level manager to line manager? The thought process has to go through that.
This
Can
is
I
about-
layer on-
This is about an hour. Okay, go ahead, Diane.
Can I layer on a component to add on to Daryl's question? Because I'm thinking of all of this and then I think, so, you know, an organization chain provides these opportunities for growth, all of those things. The lawyer in me says, how long between that and I get the lawsuit that you weren't paying me for the job I was supposed to do?
Oh, completely. Talk about in a second. That's something we got to talk about too. And that
We
gets
gotta-
one of the chat questions raised. How do we pay people for this?
And so then moving from the best intentions of the employer, employee, and all of that game to the larger ecosystem that includes laws and plaintiffs' attorneys and litigators and all of the, you know, statutes, wage and hour laws, all of those things that I think are headwinds for some of this work.
So, John, I think the question raised at the end is an excellent one, but so you're not missing anything. Deal with the leadership question, and then that was a question. Comp is very important. We got to talk about how we deal with the compensation question. Let's
Okay.
take one at a time.
So let's see, I hear, so there's mindset and leadership mindset, and Daryl, you talked about that. Then there is just the legal and, you know, the legal background, you know, how long do we get sued? And then the larger issue of kind of policies and how should the legal profession be approaching this? And that's really in the order of my expertise as well in a fast decreasing. So I'll be interested in the group's comments. So let me talk about mindset, Daryl, where I do have a little experience and have devoted some thought. And again, I'll refer you to another brilliant colleague of mine, Jonathan Donner. We wrote a piece for Sloan Management Review about 6 or 8 months ago about how to lead in a world without jobs. And Jonathan was head of leadership and talent for Unilever for many, many years. That's where I met him, and has gone on to do UK health work, et cetera. What we said in there was that what Jonathan was struck by when he read the book was that he read it first and said, this takes all the humanity out of the work relationship. That was his first reaction. We're going to decrease everybody to a set of capabilities, decrease all the work to a set of things to be done. And there's just going to be this big automated AI system. And it just pings every human and says, stop working on that, work on this. There's more value over here. As he began to think about it and the reality of it, he realized and said, this actually requires a much more human relationship to work than the one we have, because it removes essentially crutches that people can rely on not to be as complete and as human about their interactions about the work. And those crutches, we could call them. And I guess that sounds derisive, but I don't quite mean it that way. I just mean that when you know that people report to you because they're in a box called a job, and there's a line from that box to you, and you know those 10 or 20 or 50 people are in their boxes, that is a very different system than when they suddenly start doing projects and those boxes start to dissolve and they're starting to work for other leaders, often on a voluntary basis. However, as you say, one of the challenges that a lot of these providers are working on is integrating with the HR system of pay, et cetera. So here they go, and now they're being shared. Well, that means that those leaders that now share the people, maybe even through just voluntary projects, are really now a team of leaders with a pool of workers underneath them. It means that any given leader might see 3 or 4 times the number, might touch 3 or 4 times the number of workers than they do in the regular system where only those people with a box called a job and aligned to me report to me. So the leadership team becomes less like individuals with clusters of people reporting to them and more like a team of people with a large fluid worker base underneath them. And they work out things like how much they'll allow sharing, like when do I get to call it a priority? They start working that out among themselves and with the workers. So the frontline leadership, gosh, I hate to put more on them, and I think this will take away some of the friction they face. But frontline leadership is key to changing their mindset from these people are in boxes and they report to me, to these people may be shared across a group of leaders, and then I need to work with that leadership group as a team. Top line leadership, CEOs, C-suite teams, that's a guardrail role. That's where are we going to experiment with this? How much experimentation will we do? What are the business priorities that we want to apply this kind of thinking with? Whether it's a fluid ecosystem, whether it's automation, et cetera. And I think there you have a general counsel that should be prominent among that group. And I think it's there that we're going to see some of the wrestling with some of the legal and other policy issues that you see, perhaps in hopes of not producing some kind of a class action suit where all the people who volunteered say, I didn't get paid for the work that I did. So those are, Gail, that's a bit of the mindset and a little touching on the pay issue. The pay issue comes up a lot. I haven't yet seen, one of the answers is we'll pay based on skills. I think that's fun, that's good. It does, however, move us to skills rather than capabilities, which I'm a little itchy about. We see, and my colleague Robin is working on this, we often see organizations look to the freelance world to find pay levels for the tasks and projects that people are doing, particularly if the freelance world has been doing them for a long time, like software development, like cloud, like web development, even like some aspects of the legal profession. So sometimes you can find a system that's already been in existence that is a market. I would say that it's interesting that the providers of freelance workers are now often willing to indemnify the organization. Again, you'll have to tell me how effective that is. But if you give, I think it's about $36,000 a year in registration fee to Upwork, what comes with that is they will indemnify you against misclassification claims. So there's some interesting insurance kinds of things also going on here. So I'll stop there, Daryl, and see if maybe I've gotten close to the pin of getting a good discussion going.
I point one out, when we talk about compensation, the idea of people doing more than one job at a company isn't new. That's happened before. I've seen it happen with clients of mine where you might have an employee on 3 days a week, works in job X at so-and-so rate and works 3 days of another part of job Y at a different rate.
Yeah.
And departments of labor have actually calculated ways to blend the rates, even overtime, so there's no violation of the wage and hour laws. It is something that has already been done and it can be managed. And, something you can work with some legislators on even changing down the line. I think it's important in your book, people think sometimes about the concept of novelness of using gig workers as though this is something so horrific. But I think when you put out in your book about Hollywood, how the whole use of Hollywood of using freelance work is nothing novel. And you're right about that. I do entertainment clients. It's something that's nothing that different, that it can be done and it has been done. It's just people who don't do the Hollywood area don't know about it. Not
Well, the Hollywood model for a reason, yes.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, back when we were writing the Leave the Workbook, I actually did a couple of blogs. I was living in LA at that time and had the great privilege of being able to call up a couple of producers and directors and others. Nobody, people but they were, people that I worked with or were working on startups with. And indeed, there is this Hollywood model. And what was interesting, Daryl, is as I dug into it, you have these people that are not tied to one company generally in a job, like a
Mhm.
Disney or a Paramount, but rather they have a craft that they do.
Mhm.
And they're called upon to join a movie crew. Well, do the companies each have their own set of guidelines about pay and overtime and hazard pay and all that? You know what? It turns out there's a master agreement negotiated with the unions. And it's those agreements that determine the consistent treatment that you get across working for different companies on these different projects. So actually, in that case, it was a negotiated contract that provides the infrastructure that
Mhm.
allows for a kind of gig economy in Hollywood. You know, it was just amazing to me. I was delighted to discover that and be able to write a blog that touted the value of negotiated contracts as a way of creating an infrastructure.
We
John,
are
touch on one
seeing,
thing too, I think is important, your use of language. We just mentioned about consistency. So I know I have clients who have people in Title X, and depending upon which vocation, Title X means one thing, Title X means something else. So the degree we're talking about creating people with skill sets and abilities, how do we, to the degree you want to make that fluid across different companies so people can move? How do you help that happen?
You know, I think I've got one, I think we would say, Daryl, I think one thing is that we would exist in a policy world, right?
Mm.
That would allow that fluidity. Okay, so Obamacare, Affordable Care Act, whatever we call it, is one example, I think, of something that I think most people would agree has been, I mean, it's controversial, of course, as everything is these days. But I think most people would agree that one of the things it has done is brought the opportunity for portable healthcare to a lot wider group than it was before.
Mhm.
So we can think about that. We can think about, okay, we should be lobbying for policymakers to think in terms of good work and ask themselves, what would this country look like? Companies have creative solutions to this. One of my favorite examples, writing the Lead the Work book, was one that, again, came to me from the brilliant people in a company, and it has to do with borrowing workers. And in a nutshell, this is it. Siemens invents a hearing aid for children. Now it needs to engage parents and children to ask their doctor about that hearing aid. As good as Siemens marketing people are in their jobs of marketing, they are not storytellers to kids and parents. They market to engineers at Siemens. They sell elevators, escalators, monorails, and hearing aids, right? If you try to hire people who love to tell children's stories, they're going to say, I get it, Siemens is great, but I've always wanted to work for Disney, because that's where you always tell stories to parents and kids. Here's what Siemens did. They took a IP attorney, and they gave him the job of carrying Siemens secrets to Disney once a quarter. Here is a secret hearing aid for kids we're about to release, all in this bubble of IP protection. Disney brings a team to the table, and they tell him their secrets that they're about to engage or get a contract for a Marvel character like Iron Man, right? And the Disney people write the story of the hearing aid that Siemens then puts in doctors' offices. Wow. It's an illustrated book with the Disney characters helping a rabbit who can't hear very well. I know we all think, oh yeah, I probably would have thought of a rabbit, big ears, right? No, that's why you go. So they've got this nice pipeline of protected IP that lets them drop over to Disney. Another one is Disney said, we're about to engage the Iron Man franchise. Well, they said, what a great book for kids, that being in an MRI that Siemens makes is like being Iron Man.
John, how does a company start if they've never done this? They've listened to this program, they go, this sounds all interesting, but where's point A? Where do I start and how do I move forward?
Yeah, thank you, Daryl. I would say in a nutshell, what we see as most effective is a change management approach that takes this as an experiment, that applies it where the need is greatest and uses the results of that experimentation to then understand and expand it. So it is not generally, feasible, nor I think advisable, to take the title Work Without Jobs and say, I want to remake my whole HR system. That may eventually be a place where we are. But for right now, Daryl, I say look for the place where they need this new work operating system. They need the ability to think creatively about the work as fluid, about workers at fluid, like in your organization, but they don't have it. Now, I wish my book was such a bestseller that they would say, please give me John Boudreau's system, but they're not, it's not that easy. They're not going to come to your HR people and say that. You're not going to hear that. What you're going to hear is, we have massive shortages of labor that never seem to go away. We're trying to do automation, but it doesn't neatly lift and shift our jobs the way we thought it would.
We have
We have
turnover.
this whole ecosystem out there of talent that is really qualified, but I can't engage them because the only option I have is a labor contract. We have new initiatives. We have Agile that we're trying to do. And it's for some reason, it's clunky. I would say go there and just offer those folks the quiet thought experiment of what if all this work wasn't embedded in jobs? How would you like to reorganize it if we took away that requirement? And then afterwards, your HR people and others are the experts. We'll look at it and see how we'd reconfigure it. Some of it jobs, some of it maybe something else.
Daryl, another place to start is in some organizations, it's probably already happening. You just don't know about it. And
Yeah.
in the IT field, it could be happening in marketing, it could be happening in sales. There's a lot of places where it may already be happening.
Oh, yeah.
Observe them, study them. How are they working? How's it working? How's it fitting in our culture? And then spread it from there. Use them as telling their stories on why they ended up deconstructing work in the IT profession to get the projects done, how they use an internal talent marketplace. And some big companies have huge IT departments where they're already doing it. So it's a way to go. And in the compensation issue, in some organizations, they are experimenting with, if you have a full-time quote unquote job, but you want to take these internal gigs and you can put yourself out there, they are experimenting with a little bit of compensation now. Not just a development tool, but there is some experimenting now with compensation for taking on these additional projects.
I'll also add, I think it would be wise to think back over the past 3 years, because we've gone through a time and place where jobs that never existed before popped up overnight. We sourced
So
them,
right.
they became part of your they became part of an existing role, and you managed through that, and you had no choice but to do that. And when you don't have a choice, it becomes, I think, arguably easier, right? And so think back to those adjustments and maybe not peel back some of those developments that were made, or how you were thinking about the work back when you had no choice but to do so.
Especially that manager and that first line supervisor, they had to adjust very quickly to a new way of working during the pandemic. They learned a lot of new skills around empathy, compassion, etc., that are very transferable into this humanized way of working today. It's not dehumanizing, it's actually more humanizing. So there's a lot of skills that were learned during the pandemic that I think are very transferable to this new way of looking at work.
Yeah, yeah, that's such a good point. I'd absolutely agree. People ask me my best advice for kids based on Lead the Work, and we have a little bit in there about how to sort of equip yourself using the principles at the end. And I say, be prepared to be doing a job that hasn't been invented yet your whole career. So looking ahead 5 years, I think the best workforce policy any organization can have, looking ahead any amount, starts with, we don't know. So all of you listening, I think your work policy should be, we do not know the future of work. That doesn't mean chaos or abdication, because you also don't know what products you'll be offering in 5 or 10 years. You don't know what software will look like in 5 or 10 years. And there's plenty of tools that are used to develop products and software, for example, in a world of uncertainty. So let's live with a world where we start with, we don't know the future of work. Now, how do we work together to embrace that uncertainty and make the most of it?
One thing organizations learned during the pandemic, they can be agile.
Right.
And so not knowing the future is okay.
Yeah.
If you don't know that you can be agile, that's a problem.
Well, guys, it's been a wonderful session, but it is the top of the hour. I know people have time restrictions. I want to thank both Dion and John information. Jay and I always enjoy these conversations, and I think I've learned a lot. I hope the audience has, and I wish everyone a good day. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.